It is March of 1792, and the air in New York City is thick with violence. A mob has gathered outside the city's jail, a grim stone building known as the Bridewell. They are throwing stones, shouting curses, and threatening to tear the building down brick by brick to get at the man inside. This isn't a riot over food or a protest against a king. This is a financial riot. Inside the cell, trembling in the dark, sits the most famous, the most powerful, and the most wealthy man in New York. His name is William Duer. Just weeks ago, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, a war hero, and the king of the city's social scene. Now he is a prisoner, bankrupt, and disgraced. His crime? He didn't just lose his own money. He lost everyone else's too. He has just single-handedly caused the first financial crash in the history of the United States. The panic of 1792 has vaporized the savings of shopkeepers, widows, merchants, and soldiers. The economy of the young nation, barely 3 years old under its new constitution, is in ruins. There is no stock exchange. There are no rules. There is no Securities and Exchange Commission to step in. There's only the muddy street, the screaming crowd, and the terrifying realization that the American financial experiment might be over before it truly began. This chaos is the crucible. It is from this fire, this anarchy, and this fear that a small group of survivors will meet 2 months later, under a tree to sign a piece of paper that will change the world. This is the story of the Buttonwood Agreement, the secret pact that tamed the chaos and created the beast we now know as Wall Street. If you want to understand the DNA of the market, the code that still runs the NYC today, you have to understand this moment. And if you enjoy uncovering these foundational stories of finance, please help the channel grow. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and give this video a like. I am always fascinated to see who is watching. Let me know in the comments what country you are from, and what time it is where you are right now. Now, let's go back to the mud of 1792. To understand the crash and the agreement that followed, you have to understand the world of 1792. New York was not a gleaming metropolis of skyscrapers. It was a chaotic port town of about 30,000 people, concentrated on the southern tip of Manhattan. Wall Street was literally the northern edge of the city, the place where the defensive wall had once stood. It was a place of coffee houses, auction blocks, and mud. The financial markets, such as it was, didn't happen in a building. It happened in the street. Merchants would stand on the corners or sit in Tontine's coffee house, shouting prices for the very few securities that existed. And in 1792, there were really only two things to trade: the debt of the U.S. government, which Alexander Hamilton had recently consolidated, and the stock of the brand new bus, the first bank of the United States. This new market was the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary. Hamilton wanted to turn the United States from a collection of agrarian states into a modern commercial empire. To do that, he needed credit. He needed a bond market. He needed a place where capital could flow. But Hamilton had a problem. He had created the instrument, the bonds and the bank stock, but he hadn't created the rules. He had released these powerful financial tools into a society that treated them like lottery tickets. The public went insane. A scriptomania swept the nation. People were mortgaging their farms, selling their furniture, and borrowing money at 50% interest just to buy shares of the new bank. They believed the price could only go one way, up. Enter William Duer. Duer was not just a speculator. He was the prototype. He was the original Wolf of Wall Street. He was a close friend of Hamilton. He was connected to the richest families in New York, and he had inside information. He saw the mania, and he decided to corner the market. He formed a secret partnership with some of the wealthiest men in the city. Their plan was audacious. They would borrow as much money as possible. From banks, from friends, from the government's own tax receipts, which Duer had access to, and use it to buy up every available share of the Bank of the United States. They would drive the price to the moon, squeeze the short sellers, and walk away with the entire GDP of the nation in their pockets. It was a long squeeze of epic proportions. Duer was leveraging everything. He was signing promissory notes, IOUs, left and right. "I'll pay you next week," he'd say, and because he was William Duer, people believed him. He created a shadow currency of his own debt. The price of bank stocks soared. In weeks, it doubled, then tripled. The city was in a frenzy. The coffee houses were packed. Duer was the king. But markets, as we know, are gravity machines. What goes up on leverage must come down on panic. In March 1792, the credit line snapped. The banks, realizing Dewar was overextended, stopped lending. The federal government, led by a furious Hamilton and Oliver Wolcott, sued Dewar for missing funds. The rumors started to swirl. Dewar can't pay. The moment those words were whispered, the bubble didn't leak. It exploded. Everyone who held Dewar's IOUs rushed to cash them in at once. He had nothing. On March 23, 1792, William Dewar was dragged to the debtor's prison to save him from being lynched by the mob. The crash that followed was total. Bank stock plummeted. The value of U.S. government bonds collapsed. But the worst part wasn't the prices, it was the trust. In a market where deals are made on a handshake, Dewar had proven that a handshake was worthless. The market, on Wall Street, ground to a halt. No one would trade with anyone because no one knew who was solvent and who was secretly bankrupt. The auctioneers, who acted as the middlemen, were having a field day, manipulating the chaos, selling out their clients and charging exorbitant fees. The entire Hamiltonian experiment was on the verge of failure. If the market for U.S. bonds died, the United States would lose its credit rating and the new nation might collapse. It was in this atmosphere of devastation that the survivors began to look at each other. The legitimate brokers, the men who weren't gamblers like Dewar, but serious merchants who wanted to build a long-term business, realized that something had to change. They couldn't keep trading in the mud with the riffraff. They couldn't keep competing with auctioneers who rigged the prices. They couldn't survive in a market where there was no distinction between a broker and a crook. They needed a wall. Not a physical wall, but a wall of rules. They needed to separate themselves from the chaos. They needed to create an exclusive club where trust could be restored. Where they could trade with each other knowing that the other guy would actually pay. They needed to cartelize the market to save it. This desire for order didn't come from the government. Hamilton didn't pass a law creating the stock exchange. It came from the brokers themselves. It was a private solution to a public crisis. Throughout April 1792, quiet conversations were held in the back rooms of coffeehouses. A list was drawn up. It was a list of men who had survived the crash, men of good standing. There were 24 names. Some were famous merchants. Others were scrappy brokers. They agreed to meet. They didn't meet in a grand hall. New York didn't have one yet. They agreed to meet outside, on the sidewalk in front of 68 Wall Street, under the shade of a massive, sprawling American sycamore tree, a buttonwood tree. On the morning of May 17, 1792, the 24 men gathered under the sycamore tree at 68 Wall Street. It was a spring day, likely muddy from the recent rains, but the mood was far from light. These men were competitors. For years, they had fought each other for every scrap of business, shouting over each other in the street, undercutting each other's commissions just to steal a client. But the trauma of the Dewar crash had changed the calculus. They looked at each other and realized that if they didn't stop fighting, they would all starve. The public trust was gone. The auctioneers, the loud, chaotic middlemen who stood on platforms and sold stocks like cattle to the highest bidder, were eating their lunch. The auctioneers took no risk, held no inventory, and cared nothing for the stability of the price. The 24 men under the tree decided it was time to take the market back. They were about to form a cartel. They didn't draft a constitution. They didn't write a 100-page rulebook. The document they signed that day, the legendary Buttonwood Agreement, is shockingly brief. It is 2 sentences long. But those 2 sentences contain the entire genetic code for the New York Stock Exchange. The text read, "We the subscribers, brokers for the purchase and sale of the public stock, do hereby solemnly promise and pledge ourselves to each other that we will not buy or sell from this day for any person whatsoever any kind of public stock at a less rate than 1/4% commission on the specie value, and that we will give a preference to each other in our negotiations." It was signed by men with names like Leonard Bleecker, Hugh Smith, and Benjamin Seixas. And then, they went back to work. Let's deconstruct the genius of this short text. It established 2 ironclad rules that transformed Wall Street from a bazaar into an institution. The first rule was price fixing. We will not buy or sell at a less rate than 1/4% commission. Before this moment, it was a race to the bottom. A client would come to broker A and say, "Buy me a bond." Broker A would say, "I charge 1%. The client would walk 10 feet to broker B, who would say, "I'll do it for 0.5%. Then to broker C, who might do it for free just to gain the relationship. This competition destroyed the brokers' profit margins. It encouraged them to take dangerous risks, like lending money they didn't have, just to make a living. By setting a fixed, non-negotiable floor of 0.25%, the Buttonwood signers guaranteed their own survival. They ensured that every trade was profitable. This meant they didn't have to gamble like William Duer. They could build sustainable businesses based on service, not speculation. It turned brokering from a hustle into a profession. The second rule was even more powerful. It was the exclusionary rule. We will give a preference to each other in our negotiations. This was the kill shot aimed at the auctioneers. It meant that if you were a signer of the agreement, and you had a client who wanted to sell 100 shares of bank stock, you were obligated to offer those shares to the other 23 signers first. You could not take them to the public auction block unless none of the club members wanted them. This created a closed loop, a walled garden of liquidity. If you were an outsider, an auctioneer, or a non-signing broker, you were suddenly cut off from the flow of the best deals. The volume dried up for the auctioneers and concentrated instantly within the circle of the 24. The market was no longer the street. The market was the group. This was the birth of the exchange. An exchange, by definition, is a private club that controls who can trade and under what rules. By signing that paper, these men created a monopoly on the trading of U.S. securities. Was it fair to the outsiders? Absolutely not. It was anti-competitive. It was collusive. But in the chaos of 1792, it was exactly what the system needed. It created a centralized pool of liquidity where prices could be discovered efficiently, without the noise and manipulation of the auction block. It restored the one thing William Duer had destroyed: trust. When a client gave an order to a Buttonwood broker, they knew the broker wasn't desperate. They knew the counterparty was another vetted broker. The panic subsided. The volatility dampened. The bond market stabilized. The agreement worked so well that the brokers soon outgrew the shade of the tree. In 1793, just a year later, they made a move that symbolized their new status. They moved indoors. They set up their headquarters on the corner of Wall and Water Streets, in a magnificent building known as the Tontine Coffee House. This wasn't just a Starbucks. It was the epicenter of New York commerce. It was a merchant's exchange, a political hall, and a tavern all in one. But the Buttonwood brokers claimed the high ground. They conducted their business in a specific room, away from the rabble. This was the first trading floor. If you wanted to buy a U.S. bond, you didn't wander the streets anymore. You went to the Tontine, you found a broker, you paid your 0.25%. And the deal was done. Inside the Tontine, the culture of Wall Street began to solidify. Because the group was small, still just a few dozen men, a code of honor emerged. "My word is my bond" wasn't a slogan. It was an operational necessity. Since they traded only with each other, day in and day out, anyone who reneged on a deal, anyone who acted like a Jewer, would be instantly ostracized. They would be kicked out of the club, cut off from the flow, and ruined. This social pressure acted as the first regulator. Long before the government passed laws, the fear of being shunned by the Tontine crowd kept the brokers honest. They developed a unique language, a shorthand of hand signals and shouts, to communicate across the noise of the coffee house. They developed a rhythm. The chaos of the Duer panic was replaced by the hum of organized commerce. But while the Buttonwood Agreement saved the market, it also fundamentally changed the nature of American capitalism. Before 1792, markets were public, messy, and egalitarian. After 1792, the market was a private entity, owned and operated for the benefit of its members. It was an elite institution. This tension, between the market as a public utility and the market as a private club, would define Wall Street for the next 2 centuries. The Buttonwood brokers were not trying to save the world. They were trying to save themselves. In doing so, they built the engine that would finance the industrialization of a continent. For the next 25 years, this system ran smoothly. The Tontine Coffee House was the heartbeat of the economy. The brokers grew rich. The U.S. government, under Hamilton's successors, found it could easily sell its debt to this organized group. The scriptomania was forgotten. But the world outside was changing. The United States was growing. The War of 1812 brought a new flood of government debt. New banks were opening. Insurance companies were forming. The canal boom was starting. The volume of trading was exploding, and the informal, Gentlemen's club structure of the Buttonwood Agreement was starting to strain under the weight of this new money. The 24 signers were now older, richer, and perhaps a bit slower. A new generation of brokers, hungry and aggressive, was gathering outside the doors of the Tontine, looking for a way in. And just like in 1792, it would take another crisis to force the next evolution. The tree was gone, chopped down, but the roots had spread too deep to be contained by a coffeehouse. The exclusive club was about to face its first existential threat from the very thing it had created: the unstoppable growth of the American economy. The year 1817 marked the end of the informal coffeehouse era and the beginning of Wall Street as an institution. The brokers who had grown fat on the Buttonwood profits looked around and realized they were losing ground. Their rival wasn't just the auctioneers anymore, it was the city of Philadelphia. In the early 19th century, Philadelphia, not New York, was the financial capital of America. It was home to the mighty Second Bank of the United States and the Philadelphia Board of Brokers, a group that was far more organized, disciplined, and professional than the chaotic New Yorkers. The Philadelphia brokers had a constitution, a formal meeting place, and a set of rigid bylaws. The New Yorkers, humiliated by their Southern rivals, decided to steal their playbook. In a move of blatant corporate espionage, they sent a delegation to Philadelphia to spy on the operation. The delegates returned with a copy of the Philadelphia Constitution and a recommendation: formalize or die. On March 8, 1817, the Buttonwood Group officially adopted a new name, the New York Stock and Exchange Board. They rented a room at 40 Wall Street for $200 a year, hired a janitor, and instituted a draconian set of rules. The club was now a legal entity. Life inside the new board was a bizarre mix of a gentleman's club, a courtroom, and a high-stakes poker game. The trading did not happen continuously as it does today. There was no ticker running all day. Instead, they used a system known as the call market. Every morning at 11:30 a.m., the president of the board, a figure of immense authority, would ascend a podium. The members, who had paid a steep $25 initiation fee, a fortune at the time, to buy their seat, would sit in assigned chairs arranged in a semicircle. The president would then pick up a gavel and a list. He would read the names of the stocks, one by one, in alphabetical order. "Bank of America?" he would intone. The brokers who wanted to buy or sell that specific stock would shout out their bids and offers. When the shouting died down and the transactions were recorded by the secretary, the president would bang the gavel. Done. Then he would move to the next name. Delaware and Hudson Canal. More shouting. United States 6% bonds. More shouting. This process, the call, happened twice a day. If you missed the call, you missed the market. If you interrupted the president, you were fined. If you didn't show up, you were fined. It was rigid, slow, and incredibly exclusive. For decades, this call market was sufficient because the list of stocks was short. In 1820, there were fewer than 30 securities traded. The pace was leisurely. Between the morning and afternoon calls, the brokers would eat lunch, drink port, and gossip. They were the aristocracy of money. But outside the quiet, carpeted room at 40 Wall Street, the world was accelerating. The 1830s brought the first great technology boom, the railroad. Suddenly, there weren't just a few bank stocks to trade. There were dozens of railroad companies, the Mohawk and Hudson, the Baltimore and Ohio, the Harlem. These companies were voracious consumers of capital, issuing new stock and bonds constantly to pay for tracks and locomotives. The list on the president's podium grew longer. The call took longer. The shouts grew louder. And then, in 1844, a second technology arrived that would change finance forever: the telegraph. Samuel Morse's invention was the nuclear weapon of the financial world. Before the telegraph, information moved at the speed of a horse or a ship. The price of a stock in Philadelphia could be different from the price in New York for a whole day, until the mail coach arrived. Arbitrage, buying low in one city and selling high in another, was a slow physical game. But the telegraph killed distance. Suddenly, a price change in London or Philadelphia was known in New York in minutes. The market became a single, pulsating electric organism. New York, with its superior harbor and the newly opened Erie Canal, began to suck the liquidity out of Philadelphia. The volume of trading exploded. The leisurely call market began to strain under the pressure. The brokers were exhausted, trying to get through a list of hundreds of stocks while the telegraph keys clicked incessantly in the background, bringing news that made the prices from 10 minutes ago obsolete. Then came the Civil War. If the Buttonwood Agreement was the birth of the market, the Civil War was its adolescence, a violent, hormonal growth spurt that broke all the rules. The war created an insatiable need for capital. The Union government issued hundreds of millions of dollars in bonds. Greenbacks, paper money, flooded the system, creating massive inflation and volatility. Speculation became a patriotic duty and a national obsession. A new breed of trader emerged. These weren't the stuffy old money gentlemen of the regular board. These were scrappy, loud, aggressive men who gathered on the streets because they could unafford the exorbitant price of a seat on the exchange. They traded in the rain. They traded in the snow. They traded on the curb. And most importantly, they traded continuously. They didn't wait for a president to call out a name. They shouted bids and offers all day long, creating a swirling, chaotic, but incredibly efficient, continuous market. This pressure created a schism. In 1864, a group of these renegade brokers formed a rival organization, the Open Board of Brokers. They rented a building next door to the NYSE. They abandoned the call system. They created a long room, a massive open pit where brokers could walk around and trade any stock at any time with anyone. It was faster, cheaper, and more democratic. And the public loved it. The volume on the open board quickly dwarfed the volume on the old, stuffy regular board. The Buttonwood heirs looked out their windows and saw their monopoly evaporating. They were becoming a museum piece. The call was dead. The continuous market was the future. The regular board realized they had been outmaneuvered. They did the only thing a smart monopoly can do when faced with a superior competitor. They bought them. In 1869, a momentous merger occurred. The old guard of the NYSE swallowed the Open Board of Brokers. But in reality, the Open Board had won. The new unified institution kept the prestigious name, the New York Stock Exchange, but it adopted the Open Board's trading style. The call was abolished. The trading floor became a continuous auction, a pit where specialists stood at posts and crowds surged around them. The membership was expanded to 1,060 seats, a number that would remain fixed for over a century. This was the birth of the modern NYSE. The Buttonwood era of a small, polite club was officially over. The exchange was now a titan. It had its own building, its own constitution, and a complete monopoly on the financial flow of the United States. But as the Gilded Age dawned, a new threat emerged. The danger wasn't from rival brokers or foreign cities. The danger came from the inside. The market had become so large, so powerful, and so unregulated that it began to attract a new species of predator. These were men who didn't just want to trade stocks. They wanted to own the market itself. They were the robber barons, men like Jay Gould, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Jim Fisk. They looked at the NYSE not as a place to raise capital, but as a private casino where they could rig the wheel. And in the late 19th century, they would launch a series of raids that would bring the U.S. economy to the brink of collapse, testing the strength of the Buttonwood Foundation like never before. The exchange had built the walls to keep the riff-raff out, but they had locked themselves in with the sharks. The most famous of these sharks was Jay Gould, a man so universally reviled that he was known as the Mephistopheles of Wall Street. Gould didn't care about the honor of the Buttonwood Pact. He didn't care about the good of the country. He saw the intricate rules of the exchange, the settlement dates, the margin requirements, the short-selling protocols as vulnerabilities to be exploited. In 1869, the same year as the Great Merger, Gould set his sights on the ultimate prize. He decided he wouldn't just corner a railroad stock or a bond. He would corner the gold market of the United States. He would try to break the Bank of England and the U.S. Treasury simultaneously. It was a scheme so audacious that it would lead to the darkest day the exchange had ever seen. A day that would be etched in history as Black Friday. The Buttonwood tree was long gone, but the roots were about to be poisoned. The attack on the gold market in September 1869 was not just a trade. It was a coup. Jay Gould and his flamboyant partner, Jim Fisk, had realized a terrifying truth about the post-Civil War economy. The entire financial system rested on the price of gold. The U.S. greenback currency floated against gold. If gold went up, the dollar went down, and the price of wheat, America's main export, would rise, theoretically helping farmers. Gould used this argument to seduce the Grant administration into sitting on its hands. Meanwhile, inside the gold room, a specialized trading pit next to the NYSE, Gould and Fisk were buying every ounce of gold that came onto the market. They were leveraging the continuous auction system against itself, using the very liquidity the exchange had created to drown it. On September 24, 1869, Black Friday, the trap snapped shut. The price of gold screamed upward from 145 to 160 to 162. The entire U.S. economy began to seize. Importers couldn't pay for goods. Merchants couldn't price their wares. The exchange was a scene of literal madness, with brokers fainting and fistfights breaking out in the pit. The club was helpless. The rules of the Buttonwood Agreement, honor, preference, stability, meant nothing when a predator had cornered the supply. The corner was only broken when President Ulysses Grant ordered the U.S. Treasury to dump $4 million of government gold onto the market. The price collapsed instantly. Gould, tipped off, had already sold. He walked away with millions. The rest of Wall Street was left in ruins. Brokerage houses that traced their lineage back to the Buttonwood tree went bankrupt in an afternoon. But the legacy of Black Friday was a deep psychological scar on the exchange. It proved that the private club model had a fatal weakness. It assumed all members were gentlemen. It had no immune system against a sociopath with infinite credit. The NYSE responded in the only way it knew how. It tightened the walls. It became even more exclusive, more secretive, and more protective of its members-only privileges. It wasn't trying to protect the public. It was trying to protect the house. But as the exchange turned inward, a new technology threatened to tear its walls down from the outside. In 1867, Edward Callahan invented the stock ticker. This machine, a marvel of telegraphy, printed stock prices on a thin strip of paper tape in real time. For the first time, the price of a stock could leave the trading floor. It could travel. It could be in a broker's office in Chicago, a hotel lobby in Boston, or a saloon in San Francisco. The ticker was the internet of the 19th century. It created a national market. But for the NYSE, it created a nightmare: the bucket shop. A bucket shop was a gambling den that looked like a brokerage. It had a ticker. It had a chalkboard. It had clients. But it didn't buy stock. If you bought 100 shares of Union Pacific in a bucket shop, the shop owner just bet against you. He bucketed the order, threw it in the trash. If the price went up, he paid you out of his pocket. If it went down, he kept your money. These shops didn't charge the sacred 0.25% commission. They let people bet with pennies. They were wildly popular with the common man, the riff-raff, that the NYSE had always excluded. But to the exchange, they were parasites. They were stealing the exchange's proprietary data, the price feed, and using it to run a casino that siphoned money away from the real market. The NYSE launched a war. It was the first intellectual property war in finance. The exchange argued that the price of a stock, the number discovered by its members shouting in the pit, was their private property. It belonged to the club. They tried to cut off the telegraph lines to the bucket shops. They sued Western Union. They raided the shops. It was a battle for control of the narrative. The Buttonwood Agreement had been about controlling who could trade. The bucket shop war was about controlling who could see the price. The exchange eventually won, establishing the principle that the feed was a product to be sold, not a public utility. This cemented the NYSE as the absolute gatekeeper of American capitalism. If you wanted to play the game, you had to pay the toll to the Buttonwood heirs. But by the early 20th century, the exchange faced a problem that no amount of exclusivity could solve. The American economy had become titanically large. The trusts, Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, the railroads, were monsters of capital. The volume of money flowing through Wall Street was staggering. And yet, the underlying structure was still surprisingly primitive. There was no central bank. The U.S. Treasury was clumsy and slow. The lender of last resort was not a government institution. It was the New York banks themselves, specifically the ones controlled by J.P. Morgan. The entire safety of the American financial system rested on the assumption that the private bankers on Wall Street would always have enough cash to bail out the stock exchange in a crisis. In 1907, that assumption failed. The panic of 1907 was the perfect storm. It began with a failed attempt by speculators to corner the stock of a copper company, a faint echo of the Dewar scheme. The failure triggered a run on the trust companies, lightly regulated banks that held the savings of millions. The Knickerbocker Trust collapsed. The contagion spread instantly to the stock exchange. As banks hoarded cash to survive the run, They stopped lending to brokers. Brokers, who lived on margin, borrowed money, couldn't pay for the stocks they had bought. They faced immediate insolvency. On the afternoon of October 24, 1907, the president of the NYSE, Ransom Thomas, walked across the street to the office of J.P. Morgan. He delivered a terrifying message: "We are going to close the exchange." The liquidity had evaporated. There was not a single dollar available to buy a single share of stock. If the exchange closed early, it would be a signal of total defeat. Panic would consume the country. Businesses would fail. The Buttonwood experiment would end in disgrace. Morgan, the de facto king of Wall Street, looked at Thomas and said, "You must not close." Morgan understood what the Buttonwood signers had understood in 1792. Trust is a binary condition. It is either there or it is gone. If the exchange closed, trust would be gone for a generation. Morgan summoned the presidents of the city's major banks to his office. In a scene that has become legend, he locked the doors to his library and refused to let them leave until they pledged $25 million in liquidity to keep the exchange open. He bullied, cajoled, and forced them to put the collective survival of the club above their individual safety. At 2:30 p.m., just minutes before the closing bell, the money hit the floor. The brokers cheered. The exchange stayed open. The crisis was averted. But the panic of 1907 was the final wake-up call. It proved that the U.S. economy had outgrown the private club model. The fate of the nation could not depend on whether one grumpy old man with a bulbous nose decided to lock bankers in his library. The self-regulation of the Buttonwood Agreement, the idea that the brokers could police themselves and manage the system, was exposed as dangerously inadequate for a modern industrial superpower. The private cartel had saved itself one last time, but the government in Washington was watching. The days of Wall Street operating as a sovereign city-state, answering to no one but its own members, were numbered. The 19th century, the century of the Buttonwood, was over. The 20th century, the century of the regulator, was about to begin. The panic of 1907 gave birth to the Federal Reserve in 1913. But on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the party was just getting started. The Roaring Twenties was the golden twilight of the Buttonwood era. It was the moment when the private club became a national obsession. For the first time, the stock market wasn't just for the Morgans and the Vanderbilts. It was for the cook, the taxi driver, and the shoeshine boy. The ticker had brought the seductive pulse of the market into every main street in America. The volume of trading exploded, hitting 5 million shares a day. The price of a seat on the exchange, which cost $25 in 1792, hit $625,000 in 1929. The brokers were the new kings of America. They believed they had conquered the business cycle. They believed, as Irving Fisher famously said, that stock prices had reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. But beneath the tuxedoed glamour, the old rot of the private club mentality was worse than ever. The exchange was rife with pools, secret conspiracies, where a group of wealthy insiders would agree to pump up a stock, lure in the public, and then dump it, splitting the profits. It was the William Dewar scheme from 1792, industrialized and operated by the most respectable men in the country. The exchange knew about it. The exchange was it. Self-regulation was a myth. Then came October 1929. The crash wasn't just a decline in prices. It was the shattering of the Buttonwood illusion. On Black Thursday, October 24th, the market opened in a freefall. The bankers tried to play their old card one last time. Just like in 1907, a group of powerful men met at J.P. Morgan & Co. They pooled their money and sent Richard Whitney, the vice president of the exchange and the ultimate aristocrat of the club, onto the floor. Whitney walked to the post for U.S. Steel and ostentatiously bid $205, well above the market price. He was trying to signal that the club was putting a floor under the market. In 1907, it had worked. In 1929, it failed. The wave of selling was too big. The public was too leveraged. The club was washed away by the tsunami of history. The market collapsed, dragging the Great Depression in its wake. The American people, destitute and angry, looked for someone to blame. They looked at the men who had signed the pledge under the tree. The reckoning arrived in 1933. In the form of a Senate investigation led by a short, cigar-chomping prosecutor named Ferdinand Pecora. The Pecora Commission was the tribunal of the old Wall Street. Pecora dragged the titans of the exchange, J.P. Morgan Jr., Charles Mitchell, and Richard Whitney before Congress, he didn't treat them like gentlemen, he treated them like gangsters. He forced them to open their books. The public was horrified by what they saw. Pecora revealed the preferred lists of politicians who got cheap stocks. He revealed the pool operations. He revealed that the club was rigged against the common man. The most devastating moment came later, involving Richard Whitney himself, the grand defender of the exchange. The man who had tried to save the market in 1929 was exposed as an embezzler who had stolen from his own clients and even from the New York Yacht Club's gratuity fund. When Whitney was handcuffed and sent to Sing Sing prison, the moral authority of the Buttonwood Agreement died forever. The government responded with the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. These laws were the funeral rites for the private club. They created the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. For the first time in 142 years, the New York Stock Exchange was not the supreme law of the market. It was now a regulated utility answerable to Washington. The government forced transparency, it banned the pools, it set margin limits. It took the trust that the brokers had tried to manufacture with a handshake and replaced it with the trust of federal law. The Buttonwood Agreement, the simple pact of honor among 24 men, was superseded by thousands of pages of federal code. But the ghost of the tree never really left. The NYSE survived, it adapted. It thrived in the post-war boom, managing the capital of the American century. It held onto its monopoly for decades, fighting off electronic competitors well into the 1990s. The floor, with its shouting brokers and paper tickets, remained the iconic image of capitalism. But technology is the ultimate asset. In the 21st century, the physical trading floor has become largely a TV studio. The trading happens in data centers in New Jersey, executed by algorithms at the speed of light. The specialists are gone. The seats are gone. The exchange having demutualized and become a public company itself in 2006. Yet, if you walk down Wall Street today, past the barriers and the security guards, you can still find the spot. Outside 68 Wall Street, there is a small, often overlooked plaque. It commemorates the sycamore tree. It marks the spot where 24 desperate men tried to bring order to chaos. And the fundamental truth they discovered that day is still the operating system of the world. They realized that a market is not a building and it is not a computer. A market is a network of trust. Whether that trust is maintained by a gentleman's agreement, a federal regulator, or a blockchain, it is the only thing that separates a financial system from a riot. The Buttonwood Agreement was a moment of supreme innovation and supreme selfishness. It created the liquidity that built the railroads, the factories, and the internet. It also created the exclusionary insider culture that led to the crashes of 1929 and 2008. It is the dual legacy of American finance. The genius of the crowd tamed by the greed of the few. The tree is long gone, chopped down in 1865, but the forest it planted covers the earth. We are all, for better or worse, living in the shade of the Buttonwood.